A demolition in Devon for Norwich City, a 6-2 defeat to Plymouth Argyle, and one that very few people saw coming after what's been largely a pretty positive start to the Championship campaign. It's now 3 defeats in 4, and there are some serious questions for Norwich City to answer. We will attempt to pick through the wreckage of that kamikaze defeat at Home Park yesterday on the latest edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast. I'm your host, Connor Southwell, joined by Paddy, Davitt and Sam Seaman. Paddy, I mean, where do we start? I had a moment this morning where I opened my eyes and thought, oh, goodness me, it was 6, wasn't it? And it was that bad. How on earth did that happen? I don't really know how else to start the pod beyond asking you that, really.
Well, I mean, it's going to be very hard to find the right answers because it's so far removed from, 6 or 7 games the other side of Rotherham. And even Rotherham, second half, we didn't see that. We didn't see that in the first half, despite it being very, very poor, to paraphrase David Wagner, that first half at Rotherham. Leicester, Stoke, no issues at all in terms of the fundamentals and Norwich's structure and individuals within that structure, but you don't have to go to David Wagner's phraseology after Saturday's game. They lost their heads. You could say it was just that spell in the first half, stoppage time, but I think you could broaden it out. They just collectively unravelled, and individuals within that as well. And we'll get into it in more forensic detail, but so far removed from the body of work up to and including, Plymouth kickoff, because, as I say, Rotherham wasn't that far removed from what had gone before or what came after it. Yes, it was a stodgy, unacceptably anemic first half at Rotherham, but that now comparable to what unfolded at Home Park, 4-0 down at half time, 2 goals in 2 minutes, was it 2 or 3 stoppage time minutes? A complete abdication of any responsibility, and that now does pose some serious questions, just because the Championship will find you out. That is the beauty of this league. If you are good enough and ahead of the curve, as Norwich have been twice before in recent years under Daniel Farker and a different set of players, albeit, then you can prove that over the duration of 46 league games. But if it goes the other way and you are vulnerable, and teams know that and can expose that, and you don't rectify it, more importantly, which is probably where we're going to get to now as we move through this podcast and on into, we'll skip over Fulham because that's going to be a unique game in terms of the selection policy. Clearly, that League Cup tie. But certainly when Birmingham rock up at Carrow Road next Saturday, as it will be now, if they don't correct what we saw visibly at Plymouth, then it will be another uncomfortable watch, and more questions and more frustration and more anger externally, internally. So, it isn't too exaggerated, I don't think, to state that we're now at the crossroads for this season, as early as it is, because yesterday was so unacceptably below par. And the elements that go into making a team who can compete at the top 6 end of the table so far removed from that you have to really pose some stinging questions about, is this head coach, is this coaching staff around him, is this group of players good enough now to sustain? It's all right doing it in a clump of 6 or 7 games as they did at the start of this season, commendably, and they got all the praise and plaudits rightly for what they were doing in and out of possession. The issues that we thought had gone away at the back end of last season had been rectified. That's all on hold now, because what we saw at Plymouth poses more questions than answers. And if they cannot rectify this, and if this doesn't get consigned to a blip in terms of 3 defeats in 4, and they get past this and ride it out and come out the other side, then I think in very short order we will realise that a lot of the good processes that were put in place, or we thought were good processes and good recruitment, were not quite as sold in the first 6 or 7 games of this season. And then everybody around Norwich, in and outside the club, will have to deal with what that reality looks like then moving forward. So, I don't think it is knee-jerk to go down that route, because what we saw, to concede 6 goals, 4 in the first half, in such ridiculously compliant fashion, is really, I think, worthy of talking in those terms. That the season now, for me, the season now is in the balance, because you can go to Plymouth, a team who've won 22 from 26 previously at home park this season, or this calendar year, sorry, that fueled their League One title win, and you can go and you can get beat, because it's a very tough place to go. Even this season in the Championship, I think they'd won 2, was it, out of 3 at home. No disgrace in that, but there is a disgrace in a surrender on that scale, and that's why, you know, in this podcast we will have to really cut to the nub of the matter, and more importantly, so will David Wagner and his coaching staff. They're back in today. We're recording this Sunday morning at Colney. They got back in reasonable order on their nice plane journey back to East Anglia, but they're back in at Colney this morning, and the post-mortem, without wanting to sort of lapse into hyperbole, that will have to be swift and underway now, probably, as we record this, and they'll have to find the answers, because it has to come from within that group of players and that coaching staff. And if they can't find the answers, then strap yourselves in, because it's going to get a bit rocky.
Yeah, and I think that point you make is an important one. It is, in the grand scheme of things, one result. I would argue actually that there have not signs that it was going to blow up to this epic proportion. But you mentioned the Rotherham game. For second half against Stoke, they were not particularly great, but defended quite well. But as we said, had it been for Dwight Gale connecting with a shot in stoppage time, that would have been a draw rather than a win. They were pretty poor in the first half against Leicester, albeit I think by common consensus much better in the second half. So there have maybe been halves of football where they've been poor. But to put this in context, this is the first time that Norwich have conceded 6 goals essentially in the Championship since 1996. It's the first time they've done it outside of the Premier League since that 7-1 defeat to Colchester. I mean, these are just it's so bad, it's untrue. And I mean, I keep coming back to the quotes. I mean, I stood in front of Kenny McLean yesterday, and it's always difficult for a player to come out and to speak after a result like that, because you know, and I know that, and they know that fans don't really want to hear what they're saying, and ultimately it's actions. But I want to read some of the words that he said, because they're very strong, and a lot stronger than David Wagner went, I think, and a lot stronger than quite a few other Norwich City players would have gone. So this is a quote from a chat he had with myself and Chris Gorham at Radio Norfolk. He said, "Some of it is unexplainable and inexcusable. It was the worst performance since I've been at this club that I've been a part of or that I've seen. In all aspects, it was a shambles. To lose 4 goals in the first half and 6 all in is embarrassing, really, for the people that we have in that changing room. It's a tough one to take, and we deserve everything that comes our way right now. We don't deserve the support that they've given us, the fans, and it is one that is going to be there for a while. We need to learn from it. When you come here and play into Plymouth's hands, you get punished for the unforced errors and mistakes. A tough afternoon." And he went on to talk about the start of the season, and he said it's the start of the season is gone. We had a couple of good results and people got carried away. Forget that, forget it. There's work to be done. We need to come in tomorrow, Sunday, and work hard, because that was not acceptable. And I guess that point about the characters in the dressing room, Sam, is the one for me that I keep coming back to, because this happened last year. Norwich got beat 5-1 by Middlesbrough in April, and the mitigation, the excuses given were, well, it's a young group, it didn't have the insulation of experience. This was a Norwich City team that had Ben Gibson, Shane Duffy, Kenny McLean, Adam Forshaw came on at half-time, had players in there with huge amounts of experience at Championship level and at levels higher. And the problem that I have is when a team shows you it has this in it, it's very rare that it pops up just once. It creates a lack of trust, doesn't it, from the fans towards this team and this group of players, because they know that a performance like that is now possible. We've seen it, it's there, and it's going to be very hard to get away from.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and it did feel like things had turned a corner this season. And although I don't think anyone expected Norwich to be competing at the top end of the Championship consistently, I think even when there was such a positive start, it was still whispered quite quietly, those that felt automatic places could be competed for, but it did feel like this was a team that was slightly more streetwise, slightly more insulated against days like yesterday. And now they've shown that they're just as prone to those events as the team was last season. It's a really damaging one when you look at that experience, because as you say, I think the main mitigation around that loss to Middlesbrough last season was Andrew Omobamidele and Jakob Sorensen at the heart of defence, a duo that hadn't played often together and that were both young and inexperienced in that position. And then you look at a centre-back duo of Shane Duffy and Ben Gibson, obviously in midfield with Kenny McLean in it. And I think that just exposes how poor they were, especially the game management towards the end of that first half. I'd throw Angus Gunn in there. I know he's maybe not got as many games or as many top flight years under the belt as some of those players do have, but I think he's 27 now. And there was one moment when he had the ball in his hands, I think at 2-0, and rather than calming things down with wave after wave of Plymouth attack coming and the Norwich defence looking very exposed, he rushed to the edge of his penalty area and sent it long to absolutely nobody and gifted possession straight back to the home side. And I think the way that they managed those last few minutes of the first half was where it really all came undone. Players like Shane Duffy and Ben Gibson at the heart of defence should be able to manage things and realise that you don't need to go chasing it with 2 minutes left of the half and 2-0 down. Get in at half time, maybe let the manager change things within your group. But they've gone from 2-0 to 4-0 almost inexplicably, just from their own lack of concentration, maybe their own over-eagerness to get back into the game. And that game management was so poor from those players, and they've lost the game there and they've lost their heads. And I think that's probably the period Wagner was referring to when he looked at that. But when you were reading out those quotes from McLean, what stood out to me, besides all the honest admissions, which I think were a good thing post-match, was the phrase unforced errors. And having watched the highlights back this morning, that was what it was all about. So many just poor passes where they didn't have any ideas, there wasn't much movement, and players are trying to force things and losing the ball in key areas, but also how exposed they look. If you're a Plymouth player at any point in that game, really, as soon as you receive the ball, you're probably 2 or 3 passes away from a one-on-one situation with a defender in the Norwich half, and Norwich didn't look insulated against the counter-attack whatsoever. I think that was an area Wagner highlighted in his press conference. He said he felt that this season Norwich have been insulated against those counter-attacks, and that the way they've played, they've been able to do that because they've defended so well when they've lost the ball. But it was the absolute opposite against Plymouth. I don't know where the midfield was for half that game, because every time they tried to play the ball forward and lost possession, Plymouth were already in a really dangerous situation. Even on the edge of their own box at times in that second half, you felt there was a good chance they were going to go and score from there. So some tactical areas to improve, certainly some mentality and game management areas to improve. And it's going to be a really, really difficult task for David Wagner to pick up the pieces from this, because, as you say, that trust has now been lost a little bit. And I think they're entering a critical period where probably people are feeling quite pessimistic for the first time this season.
It's that's an interesting point, and Paddy, I mean, to get your thoughts on it, because the whole idea of the summer recruitment was to prevent results like this from happening. That's why they decided to sign 5 players over the age of 30, with obviously Fashnacht and I think George Long, who will be 30 by the end of the year. It was a deliberate shift, and it was one that was designed to ensure that mentality was better, that results like this weren't capable, that the team weren't able to produce performances like that. Pre-match, David Wagner was speaking about how important it was to avoid a Rotherham situation again, where there's been talk of complacency and all of the issues that was in and around that first half display that effectively lost them the game. Which begs the question, with all of that experience, all of that attempt to inject some mentality in the dressing room, how have Norwich City, for the first time in over a decade, conceded more than 6 goals outside of the Premier League?
Well, I mean, you can talk about mentality all you want, but if Shane Duffy for the 3rd goal can't put a ball out of play, it doesn't matter about mentality. It's just rank bad individual errors. If if for the fourth goal and then rolling on the third goal, what happened then was Ryan Hardy retrieves it, keeps it in play, squares it to Whittaker, who, I mean, he must have 10 yards of space, and then you've got Duffy and Gibson like pulling a horse and trap, trying to get to close him down. Two experienced players. They should have immediately sensed danger when that ball got recycled. Duffy for the fourth goal. What on earth is he doing? Backed into the box by the excellent Finan Azaz, Villa loanee. But an experienced player to be so off balance as he was. And I would question Gunn for that goal. If you look at the highlights, it's gone in the middle of the goal. Very slow to get down. And maybe even the goal before, you know, that there was a lot of power on it, a lot of accuracy, but, you know, it came from a long way out. So, and, you know, if we want to roll it on, it's not a let's kick the two centre-backs, because Kenny McLean and Zara, what are they doing? What are they doing on the first goal? Gibson's header, more up than out, to be honest, but not a second ball challenge. You've got Zara behind, I think it was Rendell, who actually meets the ball. McLean is ball watching. Zara gives the ball away for the fourth goal. If you watch that, Forshaw, an experienced player, fits in that bracket in terms of summer recruitment, gives the ball away for the fifth goal. Then Duffy tries to jump out and leaves a hole in behind. Gibson doesn't spot the run of Whittaker. I mean, honestly, experienced players playing really, really poorly. So it doesn't matter about if they went into the market in the summer to supplement what they had in terms of experience to address this mentality issue. If individual players are going to, young or old, are going to play as poorly as they did yesterday, and in that volume of players, because we've talked, you know, 4 or 5 players, but you could throw plenty of others into the mix, then it doesn't matter about mentality. It doesn't matter about we're not going to see that type of implosion again. It just really, to me, you know, worryingly highlights, certainly in the central defensive areas, a lack of athleticism, a lack of intensity and energy in terms of, can those players go again 2 or 3 days after, 4 days after they put in such a shift against Leicester at Carrow Road, high octane second half at Carrow Road, led by Duffy, to be honest, that night. This now poses for me a bigger issue about, can those more experienced, older players, can they go again? Because the relentlessness that Plymouth approached the task, and worth pointing out, of course, Whittaker, Hardy, Mumba, they were players who didn't feature in their midweek game. Schumacher made 7 changes for the Bristol City game, and they got hammered at Bristol City, but boy, did it pay off on Saturday. So is this now a squad management issue, which then gets into maybe the lack of other resources and all other alternatives for David in certain areas of his team? But it looked yesterday a very aging group of players before our very eyes, not able to handle the intensity and the youth and the power and the drive in forward areas from Plymouth. And given we know the schedule in the Championship is certainly in clumps, but over the entirety of the season, it is that, can you go again 3 days later? Can you go again? Then if they can't go again, then we're going to be back here again. And because they couldn't physically go with the levels that Plymouth attained. And, you know, even the 6th goal, you know, you're 5-2 up, it's 96 minutes on the clock, and Luke Cundle is flying out of his own half to get on the end of that cross from Bundu, I think it is. That intensity and that drive, even at 5-2 up with the game long since won, didn't see any of that from Norwich at all. So, you know, I'm not really having that they addressed the mentality issue in the summer, because the evidence from what we saw in that first half was no. It's less for me a mentality issue. It's more physical output. Can these players play at the level that these other teams, and particularly a young, hungry, up-and-coming side like Plymouth, are able to get to? And if they can't, then it's going to be more uncomfortable days ahead with this group of players. Unless, I mean, obviously Danny Bart, if we narrow the focus to the central defensive areas, Danny Bart will now come into the equation, I'm sure. But, you know, it's not a huge different amount of options he's got to freshen it up with, is it, ultimately? So it will have to be the group of players who largely were on display at Home Park. And, yeah, that's my key takeaway, really, from it all is, have they now tipped too far in terms of the age and profile of this squad to be able to relentlessly go again 3 days later and maintain the energy output that they showed commendably against Leicester at Carrow Road.
And I think that's a very point I made. I can't remember what podcast it was, but there was one about, it would have been earlier in the season in that good run. And I posed the question of, well, the big task is going to be whether they can sustain it, and particularly with the type of players they have, because you think about how David Wagner wants to play, high energy, aggressiveness. It doesn't really equate to signing players who are in that stage of their career. Not to be disrespectful, you get some very, very good physical players, and I think all of them have shown so far they can contribute. It's whether they can do that over a prolonged period, as you say, Paddy. And I guess what Paddy has probably said there poses questions about the depth of the squad, doesn't it? Because I spoke to Shane Duffy after the game against Leicester in midweek, and he himself admitted and said, we need to make changes. We're going to need to make changes. We can't play at the intensity that we are without making changes. The energy levels will drop. And lo and behold, I think there was only 2 changes made, one of which was Adam Eder, who played the majority of that Leicester game anyway, because Ashley Barnes limped off injured. It showed, didn't it? Is there a squad depth issue now at Norwich? The options that they have, I mean, it doesn't necessarily feel, and as we say, they've lost a couple of players to injury, but even when they've been making substitutions in games, and again, this has been I remember us speaking about this right at the start of the season, when they have made substitutions in games, the collective performance level has dropped. Does that suggest that there's a depth issue in this team and in this squad?
Yeah, I think we've been seeing suggestions of their lack of squad depth all season, really. As you said, I remember talking after they beat Millwall 3-1, which feels a long, long time ago now already, about the drop-off that there was there. And it's easy to talk about how a lot of changes within a game can upset a team. But I think even when you were looking at things at the start of the game, every bench that we've looked at this season has felt inferior to the opposition, even against the sides that you'd expect to beat in the Championship. And that's been a significant worry for Norwich this whole time. I know David Wagner has spoke about his preference to work with a smaller squad, but I think, as you said, his own ideals and his tactics, as well as that preference to have a smaller squad, doesn't really line up with the signings of 5 30-plus-year-olds in the summer transfer window. I know he wanted to address that experience issue, but first of all, that all comes apart when you see the mentality issues that we've already spoken about today. And secondly, you need a balance. You can't just go out there and blame every failing of last season on the lack of leadership in the dressing room or the lack of experience. They still had a good number of experienced players in the dressing room last season, and there were a significant number of technical failings. It feels to me almost like they've gone out and become almost obsessed with one issue in the transfer window and not considered what problems might splinter off that and what problems were underlying in the team last season that they haven't addressed this summer. And I think we've seen it before with the recruitment. We've seen years where almost all they talk about is the athleticism and the physical profile of the squad, and they don't consider the balance of different players that they might need. And I think the pitfalls of that are paying off for Norwich in a negative way now. So yeah, the squad depth is definitely a problem. We've been talking about this even when they were winning, and it's been almost a problem in the background that fans maybe wanted to ignore at the start of the season, but I think everyone was concerned by. And now it feels like Norwich are having a major injury crisis, but I think they've got maybe 3 key players out injured, which isn't a huge number for a club at this time in the season. And yet it feels like they've been dealt a number of major blows. So that tells you everything you need to know about the depth in this squad. And they're now looking at months without some of their key players. So Wagner's going to have to find the solutions within the same group, barring Bor Hyssaint, who's obviously expected to make his first team debut on Wednesday. He's going to have to find the solutions within a group that went and lost 6-2 to a promoted side in Plymouth. So I think a lot of work for David Wagner to do. Again, we're probably looking at recruitment and the shortcomings for Norwich in that area. Yes, they were limited financially, and of course, the players that are going to be out of contract and available on free transfers are likelier to be those older players, especially the ones that are going to come to Norwich. But equally, there will be signing on fees and significant wages attached to those experienced players that they maybe could have allocated in different ways. And I'm not saying they didn't have to address a mentality issue this summer, but I think they probably should have looked at it with a little bit more balance, especially given how contrasting Wagner's ideas seem to be with the recruitment that they've done. So that's where I'd look in terms of the blame for that lack of squad depth. But there's not much Norwich can do about it now, and Wagner's going to have to find the solutions within himself and within his group. And having seen that performance yesterday, looks like that's going to be a really, really difficult task.
Does David Wagner need to change, Paddy? I asked that question because you put a question to him on Friday, and it was specifically around the strikers. It was about Ida and Hwang, and I mean, we've discussed on here before how obviously and just to broaden it out, I don't really buy the whole they've got loads of injuries, because Marcelino Nunez hadn't made a start this season and is injured. Sorensen, I'm not sure where he gets into this team, given he's named Kenny McLean and Gabriel Sara as the midfield too. So if we're talking about injuries, really, Grant Hanley obviously hasn't been available since Easter, so I'm not really, he's not being accounted for at the start of the season anyway. So the two we're talking about really are Ashley Barnes and Josh Sargent. And if Norwich are at a stage where two players are so important to them that you take them out of the team and you get a performance like this, then the whole thing needs questioning anyway, I would argue. But you put a question to him, Pad, around the striker specifically, about Adam Ida and Hwang, and obviously there's been a lot of talk, particularly around Adam Ida and how, you know, he needs to step up. And I think we've had this conversation before around, well, and I think I might have even mentioned it in the last podcast, that it's all very well saying Adam Ida needs to adapt to what Norwich City are going to do, and he scored 2 goals yesterday, by the way. But there also needs to be an element of Norwich City adapting to him as well in order to make it work. That now feels like it's probably a little bit pertinent throughout the team. Does David Wagner need to tweak and change what he's trying to do in wake of this, in wake of kind of what we've spoken about in the first 27 minutes or so of this podcast? And more importantly, will he?
Yes and yes. And I think we saw, you know, the game was gone 4-0 down at half time. But what do we see in terms of his response at half time was Forshaw on. And crucially, in terms of this, how do they deal with the post-Sargent, post-Barnes period, prolonged period, was Gabi Zara released to get further forward and get in contact with Adam Ida, and principally for Ida's first goal. Lovely ball received on the turn from McLean. His first thought is a progressive pass, slides it through the legs of Adam Ida, and a not too shabby finish. Honest, having watched it back, you know, better than I thought in real time. You know, 18 yards out across his body, power, catches maybe Hazard out, the Plymouth keeper, with the speed of the execution. But to me, and to be fair to David, you know, on this point that, you know, is he too inflexible in his approach and how he would respond to a Barnes and a Sargent absence for a prolonged period? No, because what we saw in the second half was kind of what he teased a little bit when he was talking about because there's obviously another dimension to no Sargent, no Barnes. It's not just it's Ida, it's Hwang, and on we go. It's, well, what does that mean for maybe the 10, if you want to attach that label? You're most progressive midfielder in the central area, and that link to if it was 1 up top or 2 up top. And in that framing on Thursday when we spoke to him, wasn't it? He mentioned, obviously, as he would, Gibbs, Nunez when fit, but he did throw Gabi Zara in there. So, and then he followed that up in practical terms by what we saw in the second half. So, no, I don't think he would. I mean, you could argue, well, hold on, but he did start the game with Ida and Hwang, and it was a very structured kind of replication of Sargent and Barnes, but it didn't work. It wasn't working, and his response was to shake it up. Hwang came out of the 11, Forshaw came in, that released Sarah further forward, and yeah, I would now, and it's not being wise after the event because, you know, it was touched on before. A ball was kicked at home park, but for me now, that's where he needs to go. That's where he needs to go moving forward in terms of with the ball in the forward area, post Sargent, post Barnes. It needs to be Ida, because Hwang was very ineffective. I thought very lightweight, 1 or 2 decent technical touches, but he didn't look like a man who was going to wrestle centre halves and score plenty of goals for me on the evidence of that cameo. So for me, it's Adam Ida, and it's who you support him with. And the outstanding candidate is Gabi Zara. He has the technical ability. He has the instincts to get in forward positions, and he has the quality to score and assist. So that then places an onus on Forshaw if it's going to be alongside McLean. And you would hope with his pedigree and his experience that he can, now he's got that body of fitness work that he missed out on in the summer with no proper pre-season, that he's there, and alongside McLean, they can add the defensive balance to Sarah being released almost further forward. So no, I think Wagner is flexible enough that he will. I mean, he has to reflect on what unfolded at Plymouth, and clearly he'd already done that by half time because he made that change. So I would see a continuation of that process. The bigger concern for me now is, again, what was visibly underlined is what he does with that defensive unit, and it isn't just on the defence when you concede 6 goals, of course, but increasingly now Duffy and Gibson is a huge concern, I think, because it wasn't just yesterday. You could go right back to the Hull game. Hull's goal that day was a defensive mix-up from those two. Southampton, there was 1 or 2 elements of Southampton's goals you could lay at their door. Rotherham, even though Norwich shouldn't have allowed that ball into the box, Jordan Hugill, should he be getting the run on Duffy and Gibson? So that is a pattern now. It's a concerning pattern. But those 2 central defenders, for me, are vulnerable, and teams are switched onto it. You can see the way Hardy bullied them yesterday, and then you've got Azaz around them. You've got Mumba around them. Whittaker, brilliant display from him. Teams smell blood now. They sense opportunities against Norwich's central defenders, and that's a bigger issue because other than Bath into the equation, he hasn't got too much else to play with. Hanley isn't going to be back anytime soon, this side of probably Christmas, so the answers have to come from within, and obviously more broader. Stacey, he increasingly looks a worry to me defensively. What he is a very good attacking fullback. But it was interesting, Stephen Schumacher, and we haven't really paid any tribute to him and the tactical setup that he put in place. But he talked about, in his post-match, about Stacey, how aggressive, how powerful he is as a runner. You knew this on the other side. And they went with the wing-backs, one of whom was Mumba, to try and pin those 2 back, to try and nullify them. And after the first 10, 15 minutes or so, they did that pretty successfully. I mean, he also said we went 3 at the back, Plymouth, to go longer again, to test for vulnerability. For me, that was a signal into the 2 centre-backs, but also to bypass maybe what Norwich are good at in midfield with Zara, with McLean, setting the tempo, passing through the thirds. And you have to say tactically, he got it spot on. And that was then obviously compounded and magnified by individual errors from Norwich on and off the park. Because I don't think Wagner got his setup right, did he? Clearly, Wang and Ida didn't work. But he did react. The game had gone, but he did react. And in terms of now moving this forward, I would be surprised now if when Birmingham comes around and the team news drops at 2 o'clock on this coming Saturday, it's not Ida and it's not Sargent further forward. Sarah, which it was Sargent. Sarah further forward. But so that's a long-winded answer to, yes, I think he is flexible enough, David Wagner, that he will respond. He will accept that something needs to change. And it bleeds into the last portion of this debate. Has he got the options to change it up too much beyond Bath in the centre of the defence? I don't think he has. So that's a huge concern for me now moving forward, because from Hull onwards, they look vulnerable. They look vulnerable central defensively, and you can mask it. And if you're playing well with the ball and you're dominating possession, and we've not even talked about him, but John Rowe is the John Rowe of the first month and not the last 2 or 3 games. And Fashnak, he's gone missing in the last 2 or 3 games. If all of that is functioning in middle third and final third, then it masks a little bit those structural issues for me in terms of the centre of their defence. But when it doesn't work in the middle and the forward areas, boy, do they get exposed. And that, in terms of David Wagner and his coaching issues, that for me is a bigger issue, not the top end of the pitch. I think it's the centre of the defence.
Yeah, and I guess that point is kind of shown by the opening goal, isn't it? Ben Gibson makes a clearance in the midfield. No one picks up on that second ball ahead of who was it? Was it Edwards who headed the ball through, or Houghton, or
Randall, I think.
Randall, yeah. So no one responds quicker than a Plymouth player. And I think increasingly, to me, it feels like when you get the type of game that we saw perhaps in the second half against Stoke, where Norwich are in a deeper block, they're having to clear crosses, it's kind of penalty box defending. Shane Duffy and Ben Gibson are the duo that you want. When you're playing a high line and you're trying to move the ball forward and you're playing an opposition who have quick, powerful, intelligent, creative players, I think they kind of get shown up for what they are. And as we say, that kind of experienced element of that back line looks quite old pretty quickly, and that's the issue that they have. And I guess probably the wider issue with that, Sam, is that Danny Bart, who obviously hasn't played a single minute for Norwich City yet, but he is a similar profile of player, isn't it? It's not like they've got some, young 20-year-old, maybe one that they sold to Nottingham Forest in the backdrop, in the background anymore. They've kind of got a similar profile of player waiting in the wings, unless of course he then dropped down to someone like Jayden Warner or Emmanuel Adebayor, which clearly isn't going to happen at this stage. So that would be the concern, wouldn't it? That those centre-back options, he hasn't got too much to twist with the options that he does have available to him at a first-team level.
Yeah, I think Grant Hanley maybe. I mean, who knows what impact an Achilles injury of that extent does to a player at the stage of his career. I think he probably has the most pace in that defensive quartet, if you like, out of all of them by some significant distance. And he's shown before, to be fair, under Daniel Farke, that he can work in a higher line so that players can go and press. But again, it's that inconsistency between Wagner's principles and the players that he has at his disposal. It's not like it was last season, and the mitigation that he had in terms of the lack of his own players. He had obviously a say in the recruitment this summer, and he could have told Stuart Webber that pace and athleticism was vital in his centre-backs. Of course, when they get an offer for Andrew Mbamidele that they got in the financial situation that they're in, it's very difficult to turn it down. But again, I go back to where those decisions were made in terms of the players that they brought in and what attributes they were looking for. So I think it's up to somebody to adapt, whether that's the players, whether that's Stuart Webber, although he can't retroactively go and do that, of course, and or it's Wagner. I know Paddy obviously feels that he's adaptable enough to change things in the attacking department, but he doesn't have a track record really of deviating from his plan when things start going poorly. I think that's why we've seen such a streaky track record at previous clubs, because he has such a fixated idea of what he wants to do and such a clear philosophy, as he showed when he gave that answer at the press conference, that he's really good at getting it right. And when it goes right, all the aspects tie together really, really well. But equally, it probably takes a few games for him to accept that things need to change significantly. And I think that's been the situation defensively. It's been an underlying problem for me for a few games. I think as Paddy outlined, the errors earlier on in the season came as part of some fairly decent results, or what looked like decent results at the time. And they sort of were masked in broader performances, and you could put that in as maybe there were tactical elements that we weren't spotting, and there were strategic things that meant the duo had to be Shane Duffy and Ben Gibson. But obviously you're expecting changes this coming weekend. But as you say, the fact that they've only got Danny Bart to bring in, I mean, what's going to change for me when the personnel can't possibly change the outcome? Tactically, you have to look at doing things differently. And from what we saw in pre-season, we were led to believe almost that this was going to be a season of counter-attacking, and maybe it wouldn't have been as attractive to watch as some of the football was earlier on in this season. But I think at Plymouth they would have had better results if they accepted that the home side were going to have possession, if they sat behind the ball and then tried to use the athleticism that they have probably in Ida and in those, in Jonathan Rowe to try and counter. I think they would have certainly had a better chance of coming away from that game with a result than what they actually did, which was put 31-year-old Shane Duffy, 30-year-old Ben Gibson, who has always struggled with pace, by the way. Even when he arrived at Norwich and had that impressive season, it was clearly a pitfall of his game, and he was getting exposed for it previously. Why are you using those players in a system that relies so much upon having a high line? It's not like an offside trap has been a key part of their system so far this season. The main function that high line has, is so that they can go and press high. And I don't think that's even been done especially well at home park. There have been games at times this season in the first half against Stoke. I thought their pressing was really, really good. But yesterday they didn't get it right. They didn't see any of the benefits of having a high line, and they saw all the pitfalls in that they took that risk that every team that now plays a high defensive line takes, that teams can go long and find joy. And they got exposed for that very early on. And at 2-0 down, they should have realised that was the problem, but they went and conceded 4 more, playing exactly the same way with exactly the same defence. And I'm not sure I do have the same faith that Wagner is adaptable enough to deal with the problems, especially with the squad at his disposal. But there's, again, it keeps coming back to the fact that they can't really do much about that now. And that's probably why I'm a little bit worried for Norwich at the moment. I don't see how they can really change things. At least this summer, after the disaster that was the end of the last campaign, they had almost this clean slate of a transfer window and what felt like it could be quite a significant rebuild. Now they've done their rebuild. They've done the work on their squad that they wanted to do. They've got another 3 months to wait for a transfer window. Probably not huge amounts of finance to do much in that window either. And they've got to somehow muddle through with a team that looks really, really poor at the moment. So that's why I'm worried. It's not because we've now seen some poor performances and the number of points per game has dropped off. It's because I worry that that's going to continue for months. And I think David Wagner needs to find a way to address that, because he hasn't yet.
It's a funny game, isn't it, Pad? Because after the start of the season, Norwich City were being lauded for their recruitment. Now it's kind of the opposite of that, and it shows how things can change very quickly. And we spoke in the team news video, we spoke about it in the car as well. Yesterday felt like a massive game for narrative, and I think so it's proven. Probably exemplified, obviously, by and kind of highlighted more than ever by the nature of the result. You used the word earlier about crossroads. I mean, there were a lot of people at Norwich City who were on the thinnest of ice anyway, and I think there was a common consensus actually that it probably wouldn't take much to turn the mood, to turn the feeling. And you're right. This feels like an absolutely massive point for Norwich City, doesn't it? Because if they can't respond to this, if the picture that Sam has painted there does come to fruition, this turns very toxic again, doesn't it? For want of a better word, for a whole host of people. Equally, if they can go the other way, then and back up this performance and ensure that it doesn't define them and prove that they're capable of doing all the things that we've spoken about, there's still a possibility that this season can pan out in the way that they hope, which is to be obviously within the top 6 of the Championship. It's I think it's a really stark moment, but it feels so significant where they are at this point in time. And I think you've touched on that already. But it shows how thin the tightrope is that they are walking and have been walking probably since the end of last season, doesn't it? And it's probably been shown and magnified by the extent of this result, which, as we said, is probably their worst result in over a decade.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's changed in the space of 45 minutes, because that 45 minutes is, to take McLean's mantra. I mean, David Wagner talks about anger and sorrow, and it's embarrassing. It's an embarrassment. You can lose a game of football, but to walk off a pitch at half time, and unfortunately for those Norwich players and coaches staff, the configuration of home park, right, the tunnel was right where the away support was, so they did have to run the gauntlet. But walking off a pitch as a professional footballer when at this level and you've conceded 4 goals, and the manner of the 4 goals, it's not like they played prime Manchester City, was it? I mean, with the greatest respect to Plymouth, it was a team coming off the back, or a squad coming off the back of a 4-1 hammering themselves at Bristol a few days earlier. A newly promoted team who'd won 2 of the previous 7, I think. So clearly a team who are adapting to life at a higher level. To walk off the pitch 4 goals down, that is why we are. It feels like it's moved from 0 to 60 in a rapid process, because the body of work overall, even allowing for the Rotherham blip, has been corner turning vibe. And many of the aided by the recruitment, aided by a pre-season for David and his coaching staff, and Pelach, you sat down with him. He's clearly had a positive influence as well, to nuance maybe some of the coaching methods David and his existing team were looking to implement with this group of players. All of that stands the testament of those first few results. But, you know, you can only measure them now by, as we did at the start of the season, or by the first few games and how well everybody was doing, and rightly, the praise that came their way. But we're now into a cycle where they've lost 3 of the last 4. And however you cut it, however unlucky they were, maybe for the Leicester game, for example, to lose that, they lost it. And they've now lost again in embarrassing fashion. They went to Rotherham and they were run over the top of in that first 45 minutes. So again, that questions for me the energy, the intensity. Can this group of players, because we don't want just to make this about, you know, players of a certain age bracket, but can this group of players collectively go to those levels of intensity and maintain it? Because if they can't maintain it for more than a game at a time, then it's not going to end well. It's not going to end well for anybody connected with Norwich this season. And we thought, at the very least, that 13th position was not going to be something they'd have to revisit, that they were going to go on, and how better, time would tell. But certainly it wouldn't be that sad, slow kind of nothingness that is the mid-table of the Championship. But, you know, given what we saw at Plymouth, that now ranges into view in terms of the spectrum of possibilities. I didn't think it was possible that this group of players under this head coach, on the evidence of the first 6 or 7 games, could entertain anything outside of the top 10. Of course, you lose Barnes, you lose Sargent, and we said it in the car on the way to the game. It felt, no, to be fair, we said it on the team news actually at Home Park, that it felt already we're in a holding pattern until those 2 can get back. And by that, I meant in and around the top 6. And then you get Sargent back, you get Barnes back, another window maybe, if the finances are there to do something. But you can really attack the second half of the season. But on this current trajectory, they're going to be way off the pace, and too much ground to make up, and then it won't matter. And let's be honest, it won't be David Wagner who's at the helm if that's the case, because there was no internally or externally messaging that we're going for the top 2 as there was this time last year, or even the top 6. I think there was a realism that there was so much hard work needed to even get them in the conversation to be in the top 6. But they had shown in the first 6 or 7 games that wasn't unrealistic, to be talking about Norwich as a top 6 grade team. But unfortunately, it's headed south in fairly alarming fashion. And now it is, because the question has to be asked, is what we saw in the 6 or 7 games at the start of the season the anomaly, and what we're now getting in terms of the last 3 or 4 games, magnified by the first 45 at Plymouth, is that more of the same from the back end of last season? Was it a brief interlude of positivity, but actually the trend is regressive, and it'll only take rolling on. I just had a look there as you were talking, Connor. They've got Birmingham, the next league game, then they go to Swansea, they go to Coventry, then a certain Mr. Farker brings a rejuvenated Leeds to Carrow Road. So that's not an easy cycle of games, but they'll need to do something pretty dramatic now to turn this around. Otherwise, if the next 3 or 4 games that I've just mentioned there go the same way as the last 3 or 4 games, we're really in some negative equity in terms of David Wagner and his viability to continue at the helm.
Yeah, because defeats like this you begin to look back at last season, don't you, as you say there, and the positive runs that he's had. First, when he took over the job, and we mentioned there the freshness, the newness, the positivity of that. And then you look at the start of this season and the positivity and the newness and the freshness of that. They have been, if this run prolongs, have been, as you mentioned, the anomaly, I can't say that word, the bits that are different. So he has to try and prove that. Otherwise, the track record does. And as we mentioned before, he was walking on the finished device anyway. So it's going to be a really curious period. And we'll come back to Birmingham in just a second. But Sam, it would be remiss of us not to mention the 1,600. I think it was 1,640 or so Norwich City fans who made what was a 700-mile, I think, round trip to Home Park yesterday. They were brilliant throughout. yeah, there were portions of them that never stopped singing. And I know there's maybe a conflict between exactly what you do in that kind of situation when your team's 4-0 down at half time. They got pelters at half time. They were booed as they came out for the second half, rightly on both accounts, I think. They obviously got some stick as well at the end, but I don't really want to focus on them, to be honest. The fans were tremendous and continue to be tremendous for this football club. To go to Plymouth, which is the longest journey of the season, to witness what they witness. You tweeted it, and quite rightly, £92 it was for a match ticket and a coach ticket. To then be served up that is pretty unacceptable. So let's just have a moment of appreciation for those Norwich City fans, right?
Yeah, I think it's unbelievable. Not only is it the longest journey that Norwich fans will make this season, but it's probably one of the longer journeys in the Football League that any set of supporters have to make for any game. And when I actually heard the number of tickets they'd sold, I was absolutely shocked. It's an unbelievable effort, even from this fan base that continues to put up unbelievable numbers and travel unbelievable distances and provide unbelievable support, even when things are as difficult as they have been in the last few years. It was still a shock to see that they sold 1,640 tickets for that game. As you say, it's not only about the time commitment and the travel and the tiredness that will have involved. Financially, it's a huge commitment as well for the majority of those fans, and they will have had to sit in cars and on coaches and on trains for a long, long time on the way back with very little to talk about positively. And it probably was quite a gloomy place to be for anyone attached to Norwich City on the way back yesterday. I think I'm glad they got to see a couple of goals, but I can't imagine there were too many fans indulging in lengthy discussions about the advantages of Adam Eder finding a confidence streak as they headed back. So yeah, you have to absolutely give it to them. They've obviously travelled for probably more than 12 hours, most of them, to be at that game. And yet when I spoke to them before the game, they seemed very, very positive, in very good spirits, despite having travelled a very long way. Everyone that I spoke to was fairly optimistic and felt that Norwich were in a good position to get a result. And then, yeah, they were just unbelievably let down. Even for us who were obviously paid to be there and weren't part of that travelling support, we were over in the press box, of course. You could still feel that anger and that negative atmosphere around the club and the feeling that those fans had, even when we were surrounded by home fans who were absolutely delighted by their team's display. It still felt like quite a horrible place to be and a shockingly bad situation to witness. So I did feel very much for those fans. I think Chris Gorham made the point to you, which is correct, that although it feels quite strange that there was not as much ferocity at the end of the game as there was at half time, given they were 4-0 down so early on in the game, that second half is almost just there to process it and to come to terms with how badly it's gone. I think that's why we didn't see such anger maybe at full time as we did at half time. But it was quite a sight to behold how, when the half-time whistle went, there was almost a bit of a surge to get down to the pitch to have a go at those players. And to be honest, that was what they deserved after the first half performance they put in. I rarely criticise sort of hard work and commitment and how much players care, because I think that's a bit too easy of an explanation when things are going wrong, and a lot of fans will turn to that when it's just technical shortcomings. But I completely disagree with David Wagner's assessment post-match that his players tried everything and gave everything. I think that was the sort of capitulation that fans are right to feel let down by, and I feel very much for them. But that's, you don't want to dwell on the negative when it's very, very largely positive what they've done to get behind the team this season. So it'll be interesting to see where that mood goes from here. As you said, it already feels like it's turning quite quickly, and Carrow Road might not be quite as much of an enjoyable place to be when we're there next on Saturday against Birmingham. But yeah, you have to just applaud those efforts, because to travel that distance, to pay that amount of money, to be there, win, lose or draw, it's absolutely unbelievable. But again, it shouldn't be any surprise with the lengths this fan base have gone to support this team in recent years, and hopefully at some point they're going to be consistently rewarded, because there's not been much to cheer about for the last few years.
No, absolutely not. And I know the club coaches left at 5:30 in the morning, and we saw a few of them arrive just before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I'm sure, like us, quite a few of them didn't get back until the early hours of Sunday morning. So that's a mammoth effort, and it should never be taken for granted by anyone. And one thing is for sure, irrespective of the direction that this season goes, they've played their part in trying to make sure that this season was a clean slate, and they've played their part in generating what's been a really positive atmosphere so far. And they deserve tremendous credit for that, because there were a lot of fan bases who wouldn't have done that after the way that last season ended. So it's a testament to all of those guys. Paddy, very simple question. I think we can disregard Fulham. We know how David Wagner's going to go. I think it's going to be a very young Norwich City side, with the exception of a few. It feels like the prospect of a cup run is pretty slim, even more so than it is having to go to Craven Cottage. But I'm sure those young Norwich City players, quite a few of whom I'm sure will be making senior debuts, will get the support that they deserve. And I think it's near enough 2,000 tickets they've sold, isn't it, already? So just it feeds into that point on support. So if we shift it on to the Birmingham game, quite simply, how big a game is that now for Norwich City? And I'd probably stretch it out further and say for David Wagner.
Well, yeah, I mean, with Wagner, I don't think we're in crisis territory in terms of his tenure. We're
more for let's say more for fans feeling towards David Wagner. Then let's rephrase that question.
Yeah,
how big is
kind of indivisible, aren't they? If they're not having him, then they don't want him, full stop, do they? So I think, I'm not saying that they put a huge amount of credit in the bank, to follow on from the previous discussion with the fans and last season and the positives from the early part of this season. But and of course, Carrow Road, quite distinct from, the vast majority won't have been those unbelievable people who trekked down there. So the vast majority of the people's viewing experience who go to Carrow Road this season is positive, because up to Leicester, was it 3 wins? It was 2. It was 3 wins on the spin, and then Leicester, who I think will be the standout team, they had a real good go in the second half. So if you're a follower of Norwich City and David Wagner's teams this season at Carrow Road, I don't think you pitch up this Saturday to Birmingham and are ready to have a go and get after him or his players, because it's been overwhelmingly positive. But in the context of, if it went the other way from in terms of the result this Saturday and put Fulham to the side, that would be 4 defeats in 5. So
is it a must win? Are we at that stage? Is it a must win in terms of for the reasons that we spoke about, narrative and mood and feeling? Is it a must win on those levels?
No, not a must win, because anything can happen, can't it? You can batter a team, and if it's John Ruddy in goal, he can have a worldie, and the referee and the officials intervene in a negative light. There's elements beyond Norwich's control, but certainly within that result aspect of it, if we see the complete abdication again from individuals on that pitch, if we see a fraying around the edges and a surrender and inability to match what other teams are doing in terms of the energy and the athleticism and just the commitment, just to commit to a performance. If what we saw in its worst face at Plymouth is replicated in any way, shape or form against Birmingham, then they will be told. There's no doubt about it, because you cannot serve that up again, because to take Kenny McLean at his lead, it'll linger, but hard work is the only way we get past it, and we have to respond. David Wagner, in the days ahead, when we speak to him, he will talk about, with a view to the Birmingham game, they have to respond. So if we don't get that response, then they will get it. There's absolutely no doubt about it. How big that reaction will be, how negative, how toxic, we can debate that. But there's no way that they can serve up the poorness of what we saw at Plymouth at Carrow Road and expect that to be accepted. It won't be. But no, for me, whether it's Wagner in his status moving forward, or whether it's in terms of 3 points or nothing. No, I don't quite see it in those quite as dramatic terms, because at Carrow Road this season, forget Plymouth for a moment, forget Rotherham, because they both were away from Carrow Road. But at Carrow Road, if you're a Norwich City consumer of football, then you will have been happy with what you've seen this season. So I think that buys them a bit of credit. But, you know, we are now getting back into the sort of the territory that is uncomfortable, and that scrutiny level that, you know, very quickly that it does have to tack back in a positive direction, because you cannot ignore, despite them, you know, in that early positive start, feeling like they turned a corner. You cannot. It's not that a million miles away. I mean, they conceded 4 goals yesterday. That basically happened in April, which isn't that many months ago, punctuated by summer break. So it's not that far removed from the dross in many respects that we saw down the stretch, that 1 win in 11 period. So people remember that still. You know, it's not enough to put 6 or 7 games on the table and take those other 11 off the table. They are still there. They're still in the background. It's still the same head coach. It's still a lot of the same players. So no, I personally wouldn't frame it in it's a defining game for David Wagner or this team or this group of players. But it certainly needs to be something dramatically different for what they served up in the first half, particularly against Plymouth. And if not, Carrow Road will voice their displeasure. I have no doubt whatsoever.
Final question of the pod then, very simple, yes or no. And I'll start with you, Sam. Are Norwich City going to beat Birmingham next weekend?
No.
Paddy, Davitt. It's a long pause.
Yeah, well, only because I'm a glass half full rather than Seaman's glass half empty. I'm going to say yes. But I
that's
take
a bit unfair. That I think that's a bit unfair. I've given them credit this season.
No, that's fine.
I'm very positive about Kenny McLean all the time.
Yeah, I haven't forgotten your pre-season prediction of 15th or whatever it was. Which, if they serve up more of what we saw yesterday, then who knows? But yeah, I don't say that. I don't say yes, they will beat Birmingham with any conviction, because we're discussing this in the darkest of dark shadows of what we saw. Kamikaze, to use your phrase at the start, Connor, at Plymouth. So it's more a reflection to what we saw in the previous 6 or 7 games, and can they replicate that? I mean, if they carried on in the same fashion they finished against Leicester at Carrow Road, then yes, they will beat Birmingham, because Birmingham aren't in the same bracket as Leicester. As good a season as they've started already, it would appear from a distance. But, you know, all bets are off for me at the moment because of the graphically poor nature of what unfolded at Plymouth. You know, to repeat what I said, if you get beat the odd goal and, you know, you've just fallen the wrong side of a few margins, then fair enough. But that, by their own measure, was unacceptable, an embarrassment, a shambles, and you know, it's going to take a hell of a lot of work on the training pitches at Colney this week, because I think it's safe to assume that the majority of that 11 who line up against Birmingham, we won't see them at Fulham. So, okay, you've got a clear week now off the pitch, in meetings, in analysis, on the pitch. They have to find something. And if they don't, then they won't beat Birmingham. But I'm going to stay positive and say, yes, they will. There's enough pride professionally in that group of players and individuals that they will find something from somewhere that is good enough to beat Birmingham at Carrow Road. What about you, Connor?
Yeah, I agree. I think they'll win, and I think they'll win quite comfortably as well. So let's hope that we're not made to eat those words. And to think we've not even had time to discuss any of the good stuff that we wanted to talk about, like Stonehenge or any of that good stuff. But we are out of time. So thank you very much as ever for listening to this week's edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast. Probably quite sobering listen as you probably would expect. But yes, it's fair to say that Norwich City find themselves at a really, really, really big and important juncture, and how they navigate the next few weeks may well dictate the rest of the mood for the season. I don't think it's an understatement to say that. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you again very soon.